You sit down to write a single sentence. Before it is even finished, you are already crossing out the second word, wondering if there is a better one, rereading what you just wrote with the same suspicion you would apply to someone else's work. 20 minutes later, the page still holds one sentence, rewritten 6 times, and you are further from finishing than when you started. Henriette Anne Klauser argues this is not a talent problem or a discipline problem. It is a sequencing problem. 2 entirely different mental jobs, generating raw material and evaluating it critically, are being attempted at exactly the same moment, and neither one can be done well while fighting for the same narrow space as the other. Her central claim is that writing well requires deliberately separating these 2 jobs rather than running them simultaneously, and that most people who describe themselves as bad writers or chronically blocked are not actually lacking ideas. They are lacking a method for letting the idea-generating part of the mind operate freely, uninterrupted by the critical, evaluating part, which she argues has been allowed to show up far too early in the process, standing over the writer's shoulder before there is even anything on the page worth judging. In this video, I want to walk through the specific techniques she offers for pulling these 2 functions apart, why she argues the order matters as much as the individual techniques themselves, and where, honestly, the book's central framing has aged less well than its practical advice has. Stay with me. 2 different jobs. Klauser opens by naming the 2 functions clearly. One is generative, associative, and comfortable with mess, producing raw material quickly without concern for whether it is good. The other is critical, evaluative, and comfortable with precision, capable of spotting a weak sentence or an unclear argument and fixing it. Her argument is that both are genuinely necessary to finished, polished writing, but that treating them as a single continuous activity, judging each sentence the moment it is produced, sabotages the first function so thoroughly that the second function is left with almost nothing worth refining. The specific mechanism she describes is that the generative function requires a kind of psychological safety, a temporary suspension of judgment, in order to produce material freely. The moment critical evaluation enters, even in a small, seemingly harmless way, that safety collapses, and the generative function slows dramatically or stops producing anything at all, because it is now operating under the same scrutiny that would ordinarily be reserved for a finished, polished draft. She illustrates this with a comparison many writers recognize immediately once it is named. Speaking aloud in ordinary conversation almost never triggers the same self-censoring loop that writing does, even though both involve producing language in real time. The difference, she argues, is that spoken words disappear the instant they are said, while written words sit on the page, permanent and visible, inviting immediate rereading and immediate judgment in a way speech simply does not. Writing, unlike speaking, hands the critical function a fixed target to aim at before the generative function has even finished its first pass. Silencing the editor. Klauser's most repeated piece of advice is directed at what she treats as the single most common cause of writer's block, an internal editor allowed to intervene far too early in the process. She argues this editor is not a villain to be eliminated permanently. It has a genuinely important later role to play. The problem is exclusively one of timing, the editor showing up during the drafting stage, when its only real function is to interrupt, rather than during the revision stage, when its scrutiny becomes genuinely useful. The specific technique she recommends is a deliberate agreement with yourself, made before writing begins, that the first pass will not be shown to the internal editor at all, regardless of how rough, repetitive, or embarrassing the resulting material turns out to be. She argues that most people never actually give themselves this permission explicitly, which means the editor intervenes by default, uninvited, on every single sentence, and the deliberate act of namming and postponing that intervention is often enough, on its own, to unstick a surprising amount of blocked writing. She also addresses the specific temptation to rationalize early editing as simply being careful or maintaining high standards. Klauser pushes back on this framing directly, arguing that what looks like carefulness in the moment is frequently just the editor arriving early under a more flattering name, and that genuinely high standards are better served by a rigorous second pass over completed material than by a first pass so cautious it barely produces enough material to revise in the first place. Priming the pump. For writers who find themselves staring at a genuinely blank page, unable to generate even the rough material the previous technique depends on, Klauser offers a set of specific priming exercises designed to get some form of writing moving, regardless of quality, on the theory that momentum, once started, is considerably easier to redirect toward the actual project than it is to generate entirely from a standing start. The specific mechanism behind these exercises is that the physical act of writing, moving a pen, or typing continuously, tends to loosen the associative, generative function even when the content produced has nothing directly to do with the intended project. Writing continuously about the immediate discomfort of being stuck, describing the room, or free associating without any particular direction, she argues, frequently and reliably leads back toward the actual material within a few minutes, because the generative function, once activated by any writing at all, tends to keep running rather than shutting back off. She pairs this with a practical rule about interruption, specifically the situation where a writing session is broken off partway through a productive stretch, whether by a phone call, a meal, or simply the end of the day. Rather than stopping at a natural conclusion, a completed sentence, or a finished thought, she recommends deliberately stopping mid-sentence, leaving an obviously unfinished thread. The specific reasoning is that returning to an unfinished sentence pulls the generative function back into motion almost automatically, since an incomplete thought creates its own momentum toward completion, while returning to a page that ended cleanly forces the writer to generate an entirely new starting point from nothing, which is considerably harder to do. Clustering and nonlinear generation. Klauser also addresses a related but distinct problem, generating and organizing ideas before the drafting itself begins, and recommends a technique she calls clustering, writing a central word or phrase in the middle of a page and branching outward with associated words and phrases, connected by lines without concern for order, hierarchy, or immediate usefulness. The specific advantage she claims for this method over a conventional linear outline is that outlining itself requires a degree of critical, sequential judgment that can trigger the same premature editing problem the rest of the book is built around. Clustering, by contrast, mimics the free, associative structure of the generative function directly, allowing connections and ideas to surface in whatever order they naturally occur, with the more critical work of organizing them into a coherent sequence deliberately postponed until after the generative material already exists on the page. She also notes that clustering tends to surface connections a linear outline would never have produced in the first place, precisely because the outline format demands an early decision about hierarchy and order that clustering deliberately avoids. A branch that seems minor when it first appears on the page sometimes turns out, once the full cluster is visible, to be more central to the actual piece than whatever the writer originally assumed the main topic would be. A discovery, Klauser argues, is considerably harder to make when working within a structure that already presumes to know the answer in advance. Now let us be honest about this book. Klauser writes with genuine warmth and practical specificity, and the core sequencing advice, separate generating material from judging it, postpone the internal editor, use momentum-building exercises when genuinely stuck, holds up well, and is echoed independently across a wide range of writing instruction that has nothing to do with the specific brain framing this book builds its metaphor around. That framing itself is worth engaging with skeptically. The book leans heavily on a popularized version of left brain and right brain specialization, treating the generative, associative function as a right hemisphere activity and the critical, evaluative function as a left hemisphere one. This division, widely popularized through the 1970s and 80s, has been significantly complicated by later neuroscience, which generally finds that most complex cognitive tasks, including both creative generation and critical evaluation, engage both hemispheres working together rather than operating as cleanly separated, specialized halves performing entirely distinct jobs. The strict popular version of left brain, right brain thinking that much of this genre relies on is now generally treated by neuroscientists as an oversimplification, rather than an accurate description of how the brain actually divides this kind of labor. This matters less than it might initially seem for the book's practical value, because the underlying advice does not actually require the specific neuroscience to be correct in order to work. Separating generation from evaluation is a genuinely useful practice regardless of which brain structures happen to be involved in each, and readers can discard the literal hemisphere framing entirely while keeping every one of the practical techniques fully intact. The metaphor was always more useful as a memorable way of naming two different mental postures than as a literal anatomical claim, and treating it as the latter is where the book's confidence outruns what the science underneath it can actually support. It is worth noting that this same tension appears throughout a much wider genre of writing and creativity books from this era, several of which built entire methodologies around the popularized left brain, right brain distinction. The techniques these books produced, free writing, deliberate postponement of editing, momentum-building exercises, have generally survived scrutiny far better than the specific brain science originally used to justify them, largely because writing teachers and working writers kept finding the techniques useful independently, long after the underlying neuroscience claims had already been substantially revised. So what do you actually take from this? The most immediately useful shift is giving yourself explicit permission before you start writing to produce a genuinely bad first version without judging it in the moment. This sounds simple and is considerably harder to actually maintain than it sounds, precisely because the habit of judging each sentence as it appears is usually so automatic, it does not feel like a choice being made at all. The second useful idea is treating a blank page and stuck momentum as a priming problem rather than a talent problem. Writing anything, even material with no direct relevance to the actual project, tends to loosen the same mental machinery that produces the material you actually need, considerably more reliably than waiting for the right mood or the right amount of inspiration to arrive first. The third useful idea is stopping mid-thought on purpose whenever a writing session has to be interrupted, rather than tidying up to a clean stopping point. An unfinished sentence pulls you back into motion the next time you sit down considerably faster than a completed one ever does. The fourth thing is simply this: the internal editor was never the enemy. It is simply in the wrong room at the wrong time whenever it shows up during the first draft. Given its actual job, revising material that already exists rather than supervising material that does not yet exist, it becomes one of the more useful tools available once it is finally let back in at the right stage of the process. Thanks for watching all the way through. The blank page was never waiting for a better idea. It was waiting for permission to be filled with a bad one first.